Well, Wade, the reason, of course, I'd like to speak with you is to talk about the story of the I'm Alone in particular, and also to talk about your uncle Wade Hemsworth,
Yeah.
the composer of this song, to get a sense from you, from a family perspective, how important that song is side by side with the Blackfly song and the Log Driver's Waltz. And of course, some of his other songs that are in the Songs of Wade Hemsworth that we published in 1990. What is your first recollection of your Uncle Wade as a singer, songwriter, musician, aside from everything else he did?
Well, for me, as a boy growing up in Brantford and later in Hamilton, Uncle Wade was a mysterious and revered figure in a way, because by then he was living in Montreal and in Morin Heights, although he too had grown up in Brantford. But he is someone that was universally popular in our family. We were all very proud to be the family of Wade Hemsworth, and I'm particularly proud to carry the same name, of course. But we didn't see Uncle Wade that often because he was in Montreal. Although he had been a CN employee and therefore had a lifetime pass to take the train. So whenever he did come, he came by train. And so these rare visits by Uncle Wade always began and often ended with a trip to the train station to say hello and to say goodbye. And he would come out of the train car always with his guitar case, as we had hoped. So that meant that we would be at some point hearing and singing along with Uncle Wade in the living room of my grandparents' home. And to me, those times were so fun because everyone really looked forward to seeing Wade, singing those songs that were so familiar to all of us, and just being in the same room as him. You know, he had a very strong presence, as you know.
Was he a storyteller as well to his children and
Yes,
grandchildren and so on?
he was. Yes, I wouldn't say that he sat down and said, "Now I'm going to tell you a story," but when he spoke, his answers were narrative, long, and very well composed. And certainly something that I knew about Uncle Wade from a pretty deep vocabulary. And also that he had a way of speaking that was even then old-timey. You know, he was a guy who could have fit into any time in the 100 years before he was born until the time he lived in his tweed pants and suspenders and hats.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He had perfect diction, it occurs to me as well. He would articulate, enunciate every syllable, and he had a nice way of emphasizing his speech pattern when he was finished a discourse or whatever it might be.
Yes.
Did you find that as well?
I completely did. You know, there aren't many people who weren't my English teachers who would use the case one. One must keep up with one's correspondence, as Wade would say, and things like that.
Yeah, and of course that spilled over into his music as well, didn't it? His phrasing is very, I wouldn't say clipped, but very easy to recognize every sound, every syllable.
That's very true, John. But what's also remarkable is how much he actually packed into his songs, not only in terms of the content of the songs, but also just the number of syllables and words. The text of his lyrics is impressive. And then also there you see language on display in a way that you don't typically find in popular music. I can't really think of another song that would use the term the grand contrariety, for example, as he sang in the Song of the Old Rooster.
That's somewhat like Tragically Hip using constellation in one of the tunes, you know, and Gordon Downie, and finding a rhyme for it. What is your recollection of the first time you heard the story of the I'm Alone?
I don't know that I have a specific recollection of hearing that either as a recording or hearing Uncle Wade play it in person. I only have a recollection of my impression of that song. And to me, the story told itself very easily. It spun out in logical form. And I didn't realize at the time that listening to a song by a white Canadian performer in the calypso style, having been written when it was very modern, and it showed that Wade's worldliness to have used that style for a song that tells that story, which of course is very appropriate.
Yeah, I was told that part of that calypso interest that he had is a result of some of the other musicians in Montreal who played in that calypso style, obviously. Trinidadians with whom he congregated and got to know their music and their style and so on. Folk music at that time, when you were growing up, you're in your grandparents' house, as you say, was folk music still something that was au courant, or was it now really rock and roll and so on?
Well, for me, this would have been in the, I'd say starting in about 1970 or so would be when I think I met Uncle Wade for the first time as a sentient child, as opposed to being a baby. And those were certainly in the rock and roll days, but folk music wasn't yet, was once again popular, I suppose, was riding its new wave of popularity. But my parents and my grandparents, they knew the music of their contemporaries were similar to Wade's. Their musical antecedents were similar to Wade. So it's never been out of fashion in my family, and never been out of. It's always had folk music, and we've always had an appreciation and respect for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your father, Gordon, is he a musician as well?
Well, he is not a songwriter, but he loves music. He loves to sing and play. He is mainly a ukulele player, but he loves Uncle Wade's music. He loved his Uncle Wade, who was like a celebrity to him and to his siblings when he would visit them when they were younger. And he would often bring treats that their parents couldn't really afford or wouldn't necessarily smile upon, like fireworks. one that my dad mentioned in one of Uncle Wade's eulogies.
Yeah. I know that your Uncle Wade played the banjo as well as the guitar. I personally never heard him play the banjo live. Do you recall him playing banjo in those family occasions?
No, I don't. I'm also aware that he played the banjo, but I don't think I ever heard him play the banjo. Sorry.
Wade had a really interesting career, of course. He was a graduate of the Ontario College of Art in Toronto in 1939. He would have studied under people, the post group of seven, so the northern school, if you will. And of course, during the war, he was in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, and he got to see quite a bit of Canada that way. But he also got to hear a lot of what I would call sea shanties, a lot of Celtic music from the East Coast. And then he joined Ontario Hydro, I believe, after the war, and that got him up to Northern Ontario. Cruising, I guess, was part of it, but so too then with the CNR. Yeah, I believe he was a draftsman with the CNR, designing bridges and that sort of thing. And that too brought him into the Northland, and of course a lot of his really, I guess you would have to call them signature songs, are about the Northland. I'm thinking of the Song of the Wild Goose, for example, Blackfly song, even the Log Driver's Waltz. And that reminds me, actually, the Log Driver's Waltz. Was he ever a woodcutter? Did he work as a lumberjack?
No. He would say that there's so much content, both in the music by others that he played, and in songs that he wrote, that have to do with the life in the bush and cutting and hauling lumber and moving it down the rivers. he himself was a pencil pusher, as he said. But you know, he had to. But they stayed with lumberjacks in their camps very often, or they would encounter them at the portage, and there was a friendly and easy relationship that he had with them, and a respect for their life and their hard work that he could see firsthand, and this intrigued him, and I think it's a vein of the life of Canada that everyone can relate to in some way, that makes us all feel Canadian, to think of life in the woods, and that was part of how Wade connected with others through his music.
That slice of life, as you put it, life in the woods, and through his songs, do you see that the songwriting is more nostalgia and sentimental, or is it an actual clip of reality, life in the woods, as you would expect it?
I think that while the songs trigger emotion, they're not necessarily sentimental songs, nor are they completely journalistic at the other end. I think they fall somewhere into the pleasant middle. Now, they're, as you know, his songs were very labored. You know, I hope they didn't come out sounding labored. I don't think they did, but he took such trouble to write and rewrite and to make sure that the music and the lyrics were bound together in a sensible and original way. And this led him down what would be rabbit holes for some other people. You know, My Mother is the Ocean Sea is one of my favorite songs of Wade's, and it's in a very odd time signature, in a 5/4 time signature, which one doesn't find frequently, but which is designed to mimic the rolling of the ocean, and therefore is perfect in accompaniment to the theme of the song.
Do you play music as well, Wade?
Yes, I played. I'm not very active now, but I have been very active at points of my life, mainly as a bass player. Although I played some guitar and written a few songs and played a couple of them for Uncle Wade when he came to Hamilton, and that was a real pleasure for me to do that. His feedback was good. But I played mostly in rock and roll bands and in the pit orchestras for musical shows. But I understand enough about music to understand some of what made Wade's work so good.
Yeah. Have you had occasion to play any of his songs in front of an audience?
In front of an audience, no. I have played through his songbook as well as I can many times, yeah. And I found the songs to be pretty difficult to play. The chording, the singing and playing of those songs at the same time is challenging, even when I know and love them.
I recall Peter Weldon saying the same thing, and he was at one time trying to back up Wade, and he more or less said, "To hell with it, I'll just play what I think I'm hearing." Yeah. Did you ever meet Peter Wally, who was the illustrator of the storyboard for the story of the I'm Alone?
No, I'm sorry, I never did. I know that he and Wade were big fans of one another, and they had a great personal connection. And again, you had a really nice alignment of their art forms and of their styles and of their understanding that worked out very well, as we see, of course, in the animated version of the story of the I'm Alone.
And you've seen the storyboard, have you, in its original form?
I've not held it in my hand. I know I've seen it, though.
Okay, yeah. I have, the one that I have, of course, is in color. And I know I spoke with Penny Rose earlier today, and she thought that she had one as well, and wasn't sure if it was in color or black and white. In other words, a photocopy. But I remember a couple of years ago her telling me that she did have a colored copy of it in pencil crayon, which led me to believe that perhaps Peter Wally made more than one version. That would be really interesting to see. Now, the animator, Alison Wolvers, who did the animation based on the storyboard, has never really done an animation before. So this was her first attempt. And we're all quite pleased, of course, because it has won so many film festival awards. And on that note, Peter Wally was invested or inducted into the Canadian Cartoon Hall of Fame some years ago. He was a cartoonist for Maclean's magazine and Weekend magazine. There's a wonderful interview with him by Fred Davis in black and white, probably in the 60s or maybe even the 50s. And Peter is very shy. He's a big man, but he appears to be very, very shy and somewhat embarrassed by the questions that Fred Davis is asking him. And of course, your uncle was also inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame, I think in 2003. That was the year he died, perhaps?
He died in 2002.
2002.
And I attended the ceremony with Shirley when Blackfly was inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. I'm just sitting around the corner from where the document that they gave us is framed and hanging in my hall.
Nice. Did you get to speak at that event?
No, no. But we were certainly felt like honored guests, and it was a lovely event and it was very stirring to be there, to be named Wade Hemsworth, and to hear and to hear see others talk about his music. If I may, I've had the chance to meet Bruce Cockburn a couple of times, and when he heard my name, his eyes lit up, and he told me that when he was a young man attending summer camp in Algonquin Park, they used to sing Uncle Wade's songs by the campfire, and that he would recognize and remember and praise Wade's music was really gratifying to me.
Yeah, that is amazing. I've heard that similar reference to your uncle many, many times. Young musicians, and of course, those young musicians are no longer young, but they're still playing really good music.
Mm-hmm.
As a musician, where would you place your uncle in that sort of sphere of folk tradition in Canada? There are not a lot of contemporary folk musicians, but say, well, maybe even Bruce Cockburn, Gordon Lightfoot, folks like that.
Well, it's a big room that's filled with some very great stars, and Wade was not the most famous among them, but he certainly was among them and deserves a place, I think, in the pantheon of Canadian folk music.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think that it's only since he has died that his music has become better known, or at least known to a new generation. Living with the name Wade Hemsworth, as I proudly do, it's very often that people ask me, "Oh, are you related to the Wade Hemsworth or the real Wade Hemsworth?" And so I get to have a view, almost like a sampling of what people know and who knows him, and it's been the recognition of Wade and that name has increased, I would say, in the last several years, and that makes me happy. Although it makes me sad that both he and Shirley, and before her Irene, are gone and not able to enjoy all of this. But there's a funny thing that Wade used to say about his music and it being recorded by other people, because when I would visit him in Morin Heights, there was as you may remember, just inside the front door, there was a rack where there were tapes and CDs, and there were always a couple of new ones there that I hadn't heard before, that were versions of his songs recorded by other people. And he would say, "Oh, you would have to listen to this, or you have to listen to that," and we would sit down and listen together and talk about how we liked what we had heard. And he said, "My songs, I think of them as little boats. I make them and I set them out to sea, and they may go places I have no idea of. And I eagerly await their return." And I thought that was a pretty cool way to look at it, to say that they're not only his, he just made them. and then other people sail them. And I thought that was, you know, when you're asking about the place in the firmament of Canadian folk music that he might hold, it's a place that is I think solid and not passing, and that is growing because it is substantial, and the music, although there was very little of it in terms of a sample size, each one of those songs is like a condensed experience that can be unpacked and opened and enjoyed for a long time by many people.
That's really well said, I think, Wade, and it reminds me a great deal of something that Edith Folk said of your uncle, referring to him as an icon in Canadian music and composition and so on. Pete Seeger had nothing but high praise. And I'm thinking also of Adrienne Clarkson and that interview that she did after the Winnipeg Folk Festival. And yet Wade was so humble that he almost didn't want to accept the kudos that she was offering. But this notion that music is to be shared is really, really inspiring, isn't it? For young people especially, to realize that it's not just here, today, and gone. It can be immortalized in some respects.
Yeah, and that it ought to be shared.
Yeah. And
ought to be shared not only among people of the same generation, but among people of many generations. And it is a form of not only of storytelling, but of history keeping. And when we make something into a song, we remember it differently and more deeply. And you know, you refer to sentimentality and emotion. It is coded in that way, so that we're not only remembering a story like the I'm Alone, we're feeling it.
Yeah.
And we're feeling certain emotions. And I think he was very good at that. I think he really, really understood how those two art forms, poetry, lyric writing, and music, married so well and could do so much. When his songbook came out that he published, well, that created a demand from people to know, how are these supposed to sound? And then he decided, well, I better record them. And he had made different recordings of different quality and in different formats over the years, but not one collection that put everything together. He did many takes of things because he was an older man by then. He was, I think, 79 when he was doing that recording. But when you put it all together, you could pull out passable versions of every one of those songs. Some of them, I would argue, were better for the change in timbre of his voice. And then the next year, he had a stroke.
Yeah.
And it affected his fretting hand, and he wasn't really able to play guitar very well again. And had he not made that album, a bunch of people might not know how those songs are supposed to sound. They might not have easy access to them. So, and he continued to write. And I remember staying in the spare room at their place in Morin Heights and coming upon a small notebook in the headboard of the bed where I was staying, and there were fragments of lyrics of songs that he was working on in his again very old time handwriting. That's you know, the way that he spoke, the way that he dressed, the things he sang about, and the way that he actually mechanically printed were old. Like you know, his writing was slow, deliberate, and artful. His handwriting.
Well, you know, that's a good note to linger on for a moment, because when we were publishing the book, when we were producing the book, we needed to get the musical scores typewritten. And Hugh Verrier, who of course was the editor of the book, tracked down a music typewriter, a typographer in Norwood, Ontario. And he had one of those, I think it was an IBM Selectrex typewriter, you know, with the ball on it.
Mm-hmm.
But it, instead of the letters of the alphabet, it had musical notations. And he typeset the whole book that way on that machine. And it was an incredible technology. And he was also a musician. During the war, he He was in Germany during the war. Erich Mundinger is his name. And he was a violinist in one of the Philharmonic orchestras. So he could read music. And of course, when transcribing Wade's songs, he was astounded and was wonderful to get that feedback. When we published the book, I was living in Ottawa at the time. And I recall one of our many launches was at the Ottawa Folklore Center. And afterwards, we went up to a little pub called the Mad Cow. And the little pub was the size of a small dining room. And there was a musician playing there. And we had just sat down and the musician's mic was on and the speakers were really loud. And Wade turned around to us and he said, "Get me the fuck out of here." It was just something unreal. So we went down the street to a Japanese restaurant. But what was really interesting is that some people who were working for me at the time, they had a band called Up All Night. And the next weekend I was downtown on Elgin Street, went into a pub in the middle of the afternoon, and that band was playing. And the moment they saw me come in, they immediately played the Blackfly song. It was incredible. That's sort of traffic. It was amazing. Wade, is there anything we should add to this interview that you want to say?
I'd like to just tell you a story.
Sure.
And that is that when my wife and I were married, which was in the year 2000, Wade was by then wheelchair bound. He'd had another stroke, and he was bent over and emaciated. But it was very important to him to come to Hamilton, where I live. And he and Shirley, with the help of a friend, made the train ride, made the drive to Hamilton. And they were able to attend our wedding. And we were married in Convocation Hall at McMaster University. So picture a big formal room with oil portraits of the major figures in the history of the university, and gargoyles at the where the wall meets the ceiling, and so on. A grand room. And we had a couple of our friends who are professional performers playing music for our wedding. And we had not told Wade that we had asked them to make an arrangement of the Log Driver's Waltz. And so it was only when the song began to play that they realized what was happening. And this to me was a big surprise for Wade and Shirley to have. And Wade looked up and he began to conduct with his finger, which was a sure sign of approval. And what still brings a tear to my eye is that when we got to the chorus, everyone who was there, and that was more than 200 people, everyone sang in the choruses, and it was loud and echoing through the room. And I thought that was a pretty nice thing for him to be able to hear. And I know that it meant a lot to him to hear it, and it meant a lot to us to have him hear it, and to my friends to perform it for him. And I'm very proud of my Uncle Wade. And it wasn't until later in his life that we really got to have as much time together as I would have liked. Irene was ill through most of my childhood and needed his care, which he happily provided, but it meant that he wasn't able to come down and see us, and there wasn't really room for us to go and stay there in Morin Heights. And after she died, we saw him a great deal more. We saw a lot of Shirley, and I became very close with her and loved her very much. And I was when I was a newspaper reporter, I was covering the Canadian Football League and following the Tiger Cats from Hamilton. And whenever they played in Montreal, well, that meant I had a chance to, go up to Morin Heights and make a little side trip and see them. And so that was pretty often. And near the end of their lives, Wade asked me if I would agree to continue acting as the guardian of the royalties and proceeds from his music, and the licensing and permissions and things like that. So he wanted me to make sure that I would set aside the revenue from his music and make it into a fund that would help to support Canadian songwriters in need. And to me, that is the sign of a true folk singer and a citizen, someone who wants to make sure that this tradition will continue and thinks about that continuing even after his death. So it was written into his will and into Shirley's will that this would happen when they were both gone. That's what I do now. I'm slowly, it's not a giant flood of revenue, as you can imagine, but I am setting it all aside in a special account until we can endow it at a reasonable level so we can give out a gift in perpetuity. But it's something that makes me very proud to do and very proud of him.
That notion of sharing is really important. I know from Wade as well, having discussed this sort of thing with him. But it's also similar to his music, how he wanted to share the music. It belonged to the world in that sense. As you know, we've licensed the rights to the CBC for broadcasting the video for a year. And there will be revenues forthcoming from that, which of course will go toward this fund and the future endowment for musicians yet unborn. I recall your obituary at Wade's funeral, and I remember you were very moved, and you had everyone in the church moved as well. Your reverence for Wade was really pronounced, and I thank you for that, Wade.
Thank you, John. When I feel closest to him is when I'm in the woods, and I go on a backcountry fly fishing trip in the deep part of Algonquin Park every autumn with the same group of guys. But we have a lot of time to ourselves on the trail. There's a lot of portaging involved, and we do what they call a double carry on every portage. We carry a canoe and come back for a heavy pack.
Yeah.
And so on those walks, it's in the autumn, and the songs of Wade are so often in my mind and on my tongue as I'm walking the trail. And you think about the wild goose, especially, is one that comes to mind, and it's a segment of that song that ultimately we had engraved on Wade's headstone.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And when you're out in the North Woods, you're never alone.
No, no, you're never alone. And whether in any sense, he's always there. And I also think of the happy and fun songs. The Wild Goose is a serious song, but I think about the land of the muskeg and the shining birch tree, also, and smile to myself.
And maybe you sing a chorus or two of the story of I'm Alone.
Of course.
Okay, thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So we've just been talking to Wade Hemsworth, the nephew of the composer Wade Hemsworth. Wade, as you heard him say, was very much a fan of his uncle, who composed all of those great songs that are now part of the narrative history of the songs of Wade Hemsworth. Initially, they were published in 1990, edited by Hugh Verrier in a book called The Songs of Wade Hemsworth, with illustrations primarily by Thoreau MacDonald, and also, of course, too, by Peter Wally. And some years later, a CD was recorded of the songs of Wade Hemsworth. And then now, the story of I'm Alone, one of the songs in that book, has been made into an animated video based on a storyboard by Peter Wally, the cartoonist from Morin Heights, Quebec, who is also in the Canadian Cartoon Hall of Fame. And Wade himself is in the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. My name is John Flood, the president and publisher and producer of Umbra Press. Thank you for joining us.